Every avenue of possible criminal investigations for individuals involved in attempted manipulation of LIBOR is being explored. After all, fraud is a crime in ordinary business. Why shouldn't it be so in banking? And from now on, the multi-million-pound fines paid by banks and others who break the rules will go to the benefit of the public, not to other banks. The review will also look at the adequacy of the UK's current civil and criminal sanctioning powers with respect to financial misconduct and market abuse with regards to LIBOR.
It said, as the headline I just quoted said, we should be outraged, screaming, going nuts over this. This is the mega scandal of mega scandals. Why and why are you so outraged?
Well, I mean, LIBOR is like the sun at the center of the financial universe. I mean, if they're monkeying around with LIBOR, I talked to one friend who works on Wall Street. He said this is like finding out the whole world is built on quicksand, because LIBOR is in everything. It's in mortgages, it's in credit cards, it's in all kinds of investments that are tied up with municipalities and communities. So if they play with this rate, it affects everything in the world, basically. And this goes far beyond any
This is corruption based on corruption based on corruption.
If anything, it's an understatement, Elliot.
I'm not prone to understatements, so explain to me why that is.
But, you know, nobody should be surprised that we have yet another corruption scandal being done by one of these global too-big-to-fail banks. This is their business model. They are based on and have been based on for a long time of making as much money as quickly as possible in any way that they cannot get caught.
Guys are looking here. 4 or 5 years of austerity measures have failed to stimulate the European economies on a whole. How can economies be stimulated and then create jobs at the same time if there's a global slowdown occurring? If you agree with the fact that there's a global slowdown.
Well, let's look at the case of Ireland for a second. A few years ago, the Irish public debt was virtually non-existent. Then one of their banks, Anglo-Irish, ran up debts that were 10 times the country's GDP. They went bankrupt, and the Irish government decided to move those debts or guarantee those debts onto the balance sheet of the citizen. And then they started imposing austerity measures to bail out Anglo-Irish Bank and their unsecured debtors. So this pattern is what we've seen play out all over Europe. You've got these debts that were incurred by banks. They can't pay the debts, and the governments are doing the bidding of the banks by transferring these debts to the public and then imposing austerity measures.
Hi, I'm Dennis Kucinich. Late last month, Barclays Bank, a multinational bank and financial institution based in the United Kingdom, admitted to regulators that it tried to manipulate something called LIBOR before and during the financial crisis in 2008. LIBOR is an acronym for London Interbank Offered Rate. It's a rate used as a benchmark for the cost of lending throughout the financial system, and it's also used as a reference rate for a wide range of financial products like car loans, adjustable rate mortgages, student loans, and credit cards. The LIBOR is not based on an objective measure of the interest rate for bank-to-bank loans. It's the average of a daily poll of the association's member banks who give an estimate of the interest rate they think they would pay if they sought to borrow from another bank. It's supposed to be the way the financial system assesses the overall health of the financial system, because if the banks being polled feel confident about the state of things, they report a low number because they assume that if they had to borrow from another bank, their cost of borrowing would be low. If member banks feel a low degree of confidence in the financial system, they report a higher interest rate. And from that, the LIBOR is calculated, affecting the interest rate on financial products around the globe. What has emerged from the Barclays Bank inquiry is evidence that banks may have in fact been deliberately manipulating LIBOR rates for years. The evidence so far is that one arm of a bank responding to the LIBOR poll would change their number on what another arm of the same bank wanted, And that other arm could consist of the bank's traders who make their money on whether the rate goes up or down. This means that millions of consumers, investors, and businesses have been paying the wrong interest rate.
We had to give all of the money to the banks and almost none of it to the homeowners. Why? Because it would eventually help the middle class. Now, did it? Did it trickle down to us? No, not really. The banks mainly kept it, and that's why we're still in a rut. We haven't really recovered after all these years. But we were told we had no other choice. But that's interesting because it turns out there is another choice, and Iceland decided to pursue it. Back in 2008, they also had an epic collapse, and in fact, their banks defaulted on $85 billion. Now, especially for the size of Iceland, that is gigantic. So they had an enormous problem. In fact, their debt-to-income ratio back in 2008 was an unbelievable 240%. So the size of their problem was even larger than the size of our problem when you look at it per capita and proportionally. So huge problem. Well, then obviously you need to make sure the banks are afloat, right? Otherwise, they can't take the action that they need to take. Here's what the people of Iceland decided instead. No, we're coming for you. And not only did they have protests, but they were starting to throw rocks at the parliament building and saying, we're not going to take this crap. So instead, this is the route that they went. They indicted their former prime minister, Geir Haarde, who of course I have no idea how to actually pronounce his name. Sorry for all the mispronunciations. And then they decided, well, that's not enough, so let's go ahead and arrest the former chief executives of the three biggest banks. So there they go. And over 200 criminal charges for the bankers. Now, wait, we were told here in the United States, well, you can't do that. Oh, these are the bankers. You can't do that. You'll destroy the economy. In fact, not only did they do that, but the former CEO of one of their top banks, Landsbaeki Islands, got stints in solitary confinement. They Bradley Manninged. We Bradley Manning people who are actually trying to expose what the government is doing wrong. They do it for people who actually destroy their economy. Who's more logical? Well, let's find out. So, what was the result of all this? Well, this is interesting. They decided to give actual relief to the homeowners. So what they did was they forgave debt exceeding 110% of home value. So if you were underwater and it was above 110%, they just forgave that portion of the debt. Now, here in the U.S., that makes people in power's headaches. Well, how could you, these irresponsible people? Who, the bankers who crashed the economy? No, I love those guys. No, the homeowners who got tricked by the bankers into taking these loans with exploding interest rates. But no, we can never forgive them. But wait, Iceland did it, so we'll see how that turns out. And then they had a loss equivalent to 18% of the gross domestic product. The banks did. Again, we were told, what 13% of GDP for the banks? What can you do? They don't do it. And the debt was relieved for more than a quarter of the population. Again, here they would say, no way, that's actually helping real citizens. That would be a death knell for the economy. Okay, interesting. So how did it turn out? Oh, damn it. Look at this. In 2009, their economy tanked. It shrank by 6.7%. So I guess they were right? Iceland's economy goes down in 2009 to 6.7, down 6.7%. So they were right. Wait, wait, I'm getting further numbers here. What am I hearing? Oh, it turns out that in the ensuing years, in 2010, it went up 2.9%, and then in 2011, it went up 2.4%. In fact, it is now doing much better than the European Union, and it's even doing better than the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Those are all the developed countries. So they're beating the rest of the world. But wait, I thought that if we went after the bankers, that our economy would never improve. That we would be in desolate condition and we would be in a depression that we couldn't possibly recover from. It turns out that if you actually help your citizens and jail the bankers, it actually helps your economy greatly. Now, Iceland doesn't even want to join the European Union anymore. They're like, why would we join those losers? Those guys are still trying to prop up their banks, their bank executives. They're still funneling money to all those guys and doing austerity for their citizens, cutting from their citizens and giving to the bankers. That is a proven failure of a strategy. It didn't work in Europe. It hasn't worked in the United States of America. The one place where they did what at the time Paul Krugman said, I said, Simon Johnson said, so many other of top economists said, hey, why don't we nationalize the banks? Why don't we give relief to actual citizens instead of the top banking executives that caused the collapse? Well, they tried it in Iceland, and it worked. It worked better than almost anywhere else in the world. Finally, Fitch Ratings, which gives them, of course, the ratings based on, how well they're doing, how stable they are, etc., had to conclude at the end, quote, the unorthodox crisis policy response has succeeded. It was so unorthodox to actually give the advantage to the citizens rather than the bankers, but shockingly enough, it has succeeded. There is another way of doing it. Iceland did it. It worked. It would also work here in the United States, but since our politicians are corrupt and captured by those top banking and multinational corporation executives, we will not do that, because our politicians do not work for the population. They have no interest in helping the population. They work for the banking executives and all of their other top donors. So don't let them lie to you and tell you, oh no, we have to help the bankers, otherwise there's no way to help the economy. It is the exact opposite of the truth. If you actually went after the bankers, you would help the economy.
JP Morgan paid him off for the Iraq war. 3 months after we invaded Iraq, they held up the Iraq bank for $20 billion. He was then paid $6 million every year and still is from JP Morgan 6 months after he left office. The man is a war criminal.
It's extremely important. So think of it this way. The biggest banks in London each morning announce what they're going to charge each other for money, and that number is averaged. So LIBOR is just an acronym for the names of these banks and the offering of it. London Interbank Offered Rate, well, whatever that rate is the baseline for millions of other loans and mortgages around the country. LIBOR plus 2, you'll pay that baseline plus another 2 percentage points. We now discover that some of the London banks, many of whom also do business in the United States, were intentionally inaccurately reporting what those numbers were, so as to goose up this rate, so as to be paid a higher interest rate. Now that affects many, many banks and many people paying their loans, some of whom have nothing to do with the banks that concocted this. You may get a loan from the First National Bank of Oxford, Mississippi, and they may say, Shep, you're a good risk, we're going to charge you LIBOR. Your rate went up because of these shenanigans in London, even though your bank in Oxford had nothing to do with it. Your bank overcharged you in my hypothetical, and you overpaid. Now comes the government. The government decides to prosecute criminally, to sue civilly, and to administer, to regulate administratively. And they collect hundreds of millions in fees and fines from the banks. Question, where does that money go? To the government, not to the innocent lenders who overpaid because LIBOR was inaccurately calculated.
Well, now I'd be very curious to know who knew what when, especially when the government is making money off this, and it sounds like a tax on us all.
Well, what's very serious, and you mentioned it a few moments ago at the end of the intro here, is the present Secretary of the Treasury, Timothy Geithner, was the president of the New York Federal Reserve at the time that this was going on. Did he know about it? Did he look the other way? Did the New York Federal Reserve have any liability here? We'll see how deep the Obama Justice Department wants to dig as it investigates this one.
Well, there's been a lot written already, and it sounds like, strangely, a lot of people knew this was going on.
Shep, you're talking about millions of loans and trillions of dollars. This may very well be one of the largest instances of bank-orchestrated fraud in the history of the world.
Let's get Bob Diamond. He's here to talk about Barclays directly. Hi, I'm Bob Diamond. I run Barclays Bank in the UK. Yeah, I'm as guilty as sin. I am involved in massive fraud with the LIBOR market, interest rates, manipulation, insider trading. That's me, Bob Diamond.